Welcome to the 2017 Cattle Industry Summer Business Meeting and the rollout of the 2016 National Beef Quality Audit. I'm Craig Uden, President of NCBA, and Nebraska cow-calf producer and feedlot owner. This is the sixth time the National Quality Beef Audit has been conducted by NCBA as a contractor to the beef checkoff, and we are proud to have led the way on all 6 audits, beginning clear back in 1991. Which doesn't seem that long ago. Over the years, learning from the audit has led to significant improvements in the way we raise cattle and how we deliver a better product to consumers. As the industry, we have picked up most of the low-hanging fruit 20 years ago, but you'll see for the most current audit that we continue to make improvements, and there's still more work to be done. I've had the privilege of working on this, I believe, 3 times. And it always amazes me how much progress we have made. And truly, as I go out through the industry and I buy calves and I get to go watch operations and view things, there's definitely a difference in the country today. The quality of the cattle, the health of the cattle, and just the genetic and management improvements that have been made in the industry. There's a reason we have 80% grading cattle as an industry. There's a reason that we have virtually no residue. It does make a difference because not only the work gets done here, but through this kind of collaborated effort, the work gets disseminated out back to the country. And that's what I'm most proud of. And as we've talked about before, we have got a lot of low-hanging fruit out of the way. And now we have other issues that get a little more dicey and a little more interesting on how to explain to producers out there how we're going to address those issues in the future. Some people have got the basics, and that's a good point. But as we look at the other aspects of the industry and how we deal with sustainability and continuous improvement, the challenges that we have from the consumer of how and how we raise our product and what technologies we do and don't use, it's vitally important we stay engaged and keep moving the industry forward. So that's my little spiel for this morning. Now I'll hand it over to Josh White, Executive Director of Producer Education with NCBA, to provide the details on the presentation today. Josh?
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.
All right, so just to give you a quick rundown of the schedule, since we didn't provide you with a program this morning, I'll echo Craig's thanks as well. Thanks for getting up early and joining us. I think you'll find this information extremely interesting and beneficial for your operation or your company. We're going to kick off with Dr. Belk, and I'll give full introductions of these folks in just a moment, with some background information about the history of the quality audit and the process that we've gone through clear back to '91, as Craig mentioned, and then he'll also cover face-to-face interviews. Then Dr. Savell, assisted by Clay Eastwood, one of the lead researchers in his team, will talk about the implant data, and Deb Van Overbeck will wrap up with our strategy workshop and sort of bring everything together, and then we'll follow that with some Q&A. So I did want to point out, you'll see some information scattered around. We put out the 4-pager summary of the executives, of the larger executive summary for you on the tables. We also have a note card there, an index card. So if you don't want to get up on a mic, but you want to get a question in, feel free during the presentation to write that down on an index card so it's ready to go when we get to Q&A. The other option is just shoot me an email. I've got service in this building, thankfully, and so you can shoot me an email with a question. Just put NBQA in the subject line, and I'll gather up those questions, and I'll be moderating out the questions at the end. The other option is we will have some roving mics, and you can stand up and ask a question toward the end. Depending on how much time we have, we'll do as much of that as we can. So with that, I'm going to do a quick introduction of all of our speakers, so we won't be interrupting the speakers once we get going, and then we'll get on our way. So I'm going to do this in reverse order and end with Dr. Belk, who will be our first presenter. So Dr. Deb Van Overbeck has a Bachelor of Science in Animal Science from University of Nebraska and a Master's of Science and PhD in Animal Science from Colorado State University. Deb joined the Department of Animal Sciences at Oklahoma State University in 2005. She's responsible for teaching undergraduate and graduate courses in animal sciences and currently serves as the interim assistant dean for academic programs for the College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources. Her research focuses on quality and sensory attributes related to beef cattle management, and she's participated in many of the national beef quality audits over the years. Dr. Savell, Jeff Savell, is University Distinguished Professor, Regents Professor E.M. Manny Rosenthal Chairholder, and the leader of the Meat Science Section in the Department of Animal Sciences at Texas A&M University. In addition, he holds an appointment on the Faculty of Food Science and Technology. He's done all of his education at Texas A&M, makes that real simple to read. He's taught over 9,000 Aggies since 1982. Has chaired or co-chaired over 130 graduate students who have become leaders in academia, industry, and government. Dr. Savell's awards and industry service highlights are too many to list, but do want to point out that he has been a key research partner for all 6 of our steer and heifer national beef quality audits all the way back to '91. Clay Eastwood will be assisting Dr. Savell in the Implant data rollout. She is going to present the harvest data. She is from New Braunfels, Texas, received both her bachelor's and master's degree in animal science from A&M and hopes to finish her PhD by around May of next year, focusing on fresh meat quality and food safety under the guidance of Dr. Savell and Dr. Carrie Gehring in the meat science section at A&M. After completing her PhD, she plans to pursue a career that bridges U.S. and international meat and livestock industries. And then Dr. Belk, Dr. Keith Belk, is a professor and holder of the Ken and Myra Montford Endowed Chair in Meat Science with the Center for Meat Safety and Quality, Department of Animal Sciences, and professor in the Colorado School of Public Health at Colorado State University. He earned his BS and MS at CSU and a PhD from Texas A&M. He worked briefly in the private sector early on as a buyer for Safeway and then worked for USD Ag Marketing Service in Washington, D.C. as an international marketing specialist before joining CSU faculty in 1995. He has co-authored or authored 206 refereed scientific journal articles, over 740 total publications, generated over $19 million in external funding for research at CSU, and is primary inventor on 2 patents. Again, too many awards and association leadership roles to list here, but definitely recognized internationally as a leader in meat science research. So Dr. Belk, if you'll come on up, we'll hand it over to you. We'll get this show rolling. If y'all will, welcome Dr. Belk to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear okay? I want to start out this morning by thanking and expressing my appreciation to the rest of the research team that we worked with on this project. I started my role with the National Beef Quality Audit in 1991 as a graduate student, so that may tell you something about how far we've come. But this last audit that we've just completed with this entire team, including Josh and staff at NCBA, has been really one of the best. And I think you're really going to see that there was a lot of effort expended on this audit, and we've learned some very valuable things, I hope. I want to talk to you just for a minute about the role of the National Beef Quality Audit and a little bit about how it came to be. Many of you will remember that pre-1990, we were having a bit of difficulty in the beef industry. Our per capita market consumption in the United States was declining. Prices were declining. It was tough. And so starting in about 1990, several people, including Dr. Darrell Wilkes and Chuck Lambert, who at that time worked for NCA, they recognized the opportunity to perhaps implement a new philosophy of manufacturing in the beef cattle industry. And that philosophy of manufacturing was based on the work of W. Edwards Deming. Dr. Deming was a statistician and mathematician who had been sent to Japan following World War II to reestablish their commercial and economic business lines. Dr. Deming always said that without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And so the idea behind his philosophy was you collect data, you analyze it, and then you make production adjustments based on those data to assist. Dr. Deming's background was actually based on learning from Dr. Walter Shewart, who was the guy that actually invented the concept of statistical process control, who many of you have read about in the past. Dr. Deming, being a mathematician, thought that the mathematics behind the idea of statistical process control were very useful in terms of identifying places where production efficiencies could be added to the system, and so he adopted those into his philosophy. In 1946, then, Douglas MacArthur took him to Japan, and that's where he began the process of rebuilding the commercial industry and the economics in Japan. Basically, they experienced in the Japanese economy about 10% growth between 1952 and 1970. The point being that because of his philosophies, their businesses became more efficient. They produced products that garnered more satisfaction with consumers based on the per dollar spent. And as a consequence, the manufacturers in Japan captured market share all around the world. That included in the United States, where many of you are familiar now with Toyota. Toyota didn't have any market share in the United States prior to the mid-1970s, but now is the largest automotive manufacturer in the world. And it was due in part largely to the teachings of Dr. Deming in Japan after World War II. As a consequence, Ford Motor Company adopted his teachings as well, and that's where some of you will remember the idea behind Ford is Job Quality One came from. That's where that concept came from. Basically, Dr. Deming's philosophy goes like this. Steve Cornett summarized it, I thought, really nicely and when we did the first National Beef Quality Audit. He said the idea behind Deming's main points is to control quality at every step. It's very similar to the idea of HACCP, if you're familiar with the food safety system. It's the idea that you identify at each point in the production chain things that you can do to prevent a quality defect from occurring rather than waiting out until the end of the chain to catch it after the product has already been manufactured. All of you probably could reach in your slacks at some point in your lifetime and pull out a little piece of paper that said, inspected by number 12. That's the philosophy that we don't want to use in the beef cattle industry, because that means that we're searching for quality defects after we've already put all the resources into manufacturing the product to begin with. What we'd like to do is prevent defects from occurring in the first place, and that was Dr. Deming's philosophy. In about 1989, Chuck Lambert, who was then working for NCA, and a lot of you will remember Chuck, he developed a paper, he was an ag economist, and he developed a paper called Lost Opportunities in the Beef Industry. And that paper was based on this idea that perhaps we could start to think about incorporating Dr. Deming's philosophies into beef cattle production. Dr. Lambert showed that we were probably sacrificing, and remember this is in 1989 dollars, about $12 billion annually in lost revenue that was a consequence of basically quality defects being generated in the industry. That totaled to about $458 per head, and I think most of you would agree, particularly if you're in the cow-calf industry, that another $400 a head would be pretty attractive at multiple times. So the original rationale for the audit was the cattle industry cannot expect improvements in prices for its products or its byproducts when quality doesn't warrant those such increases. So the idea is, let's produce a product more efficiently with less inputs that is of greater quality that will satisfy more consumers per dollar that we charge them for the product, and by that manner capture more market share, which will benefit the entire production chain. And so in 1991, we conducted the first National Beef Quality Audit for fed cattle and steers and heifers. And since then, as has been mentioned a couple of times this morning by Craig and Josh, this is now the 6th audit that's been conducted for fed cattle. My job to you for you this morning is to report on the first part of the National Beef Quality Audit, which is the conduction of the face-to-face interviews portion of data collection. As many of you will know, this has evolved significantly from the manner in which it was conducted in 1991. Today, we use a much more sophisticated mechanism for capturing data and information here. We use computer systems, and we use basically software that has the opportunity to change the questions depending on what the previous answer in the survey or the interview was. These are all conducted, as I said, for the most part, face-to-face. And the reason they're conducted face-to-face is, as you all know, if I just ask somebody to check some boxes on a survey, I'm not really going to capture a whole lot of gut reaction about the issues associated with things. And so what we've tried to do is get in front of people and record everything that they say about things that are important to them relative to beef quality. In this study, we've conducted, we interviewed 36 packers, 35 retailers, 29 food service chains, further processors. We included 64 different companies, and then we evaluated or included in the interviews 30 peripheral government and trade organizations. This includes staff of NCBA, but it includes several government agencies, several allied trade associations, etc. So when you make the computations mathematically, what this means is we've asked companies in the packing industry that cover over 92% of all the beef slaughtered in the United States what they think about quality. So we've covered most of the industry. In the retail portion of the industry, we've covered about 55%, and in food service, we're right at 25%, probably closer to 30 or 35%, but we don't have real good numbers on that. The way that we do the interview portion of this study is we break the questions into 7 categories, or buckets as we call them sometimes. These buckets are basically 7 things that you could say are associated with quality of the product as it is presented to you and your company. We don't tell them what these buckets mean, and in fact the first portion of the interview is for them to tell us what these buckets mean to them. And so some of the sectors of the industry define what these buckets mean differentially from each other, and so we have to take that into account then when we look at what they're saying at the end of the interview process. So what does this mean to your company? As I said, we asked them to identify each of these buckets. I'm not going to show you all of these definitions because it would just take too much time this morning, but I'm going to show you a couple just to give you an idea of what that looks like. So here is the definitions by sector, by market sector, for what food safety means to each of the companies. And you can see that across those various sectors of the supply chain, there's some variability in what that topic means to them. And what we've found by also interviewing and surveying in non-direct methodology producers, all of you, is we found that there's sometimes a disconnect between what this topic means between production and then your customers downstream in the production chain. Here's the same sort of definitions for eating satisfaction. And I'm showing you these 2 in particular because, as you're going to see in a few minutes, they are by far and away the 2 most important quality buckets to the industry post-livestock production. One of our further processors said that eating satisfaction is paramount. All of the forks of the organization come down to customer satisfaction. It's what we hang our hat on relative to beef production. We'll talk more about that in a couple minutes. As part of this interview process, because we've made it more sophisticated in how the questions are asked, we're able to conduct what's called an economic study or a willingness to pay study. And I won't stand up here and tell you that I'm an ag economist because I'm clearly not. But the economists have worked with us and helped us to do this so that we've designed it appropriately relative to asking the kinds of questions that we're interested in answering. We break the questions really into 2 categories. The first question we ask them is, what things must the product have before you would buy it at all? In other words, what are the must-haves that are a requirement to do business with the supply chain to begin with? The second part of it is then once those must-haves are satisfied with product quality, or it could be something else, then would you be willing to pay more for additional things that we could add to the product by way of adding quality? So something goes something like this. A must-have is a non-negotiable quality factor that must be included in the purchasing agreement before the transaction can take place. So we give you an example. The product has to come from a USDA inspected facility before we can buy it, period. We can't buy it at any price if it doesn't meet that criteria. That's a must-have. Then we ask questions, okay, beyond that, let's say we can provide that to you, then what could you do relative to pricing if we were to guarantee you these additional quality attributes? Those are the willingness to pay components of the study. So relative to must-have, we're asking for the things that they're going to require in product attributes before they'll purchase the product at all. This is what those data looked at like in 2016. Basically, you'll notice that if you compare these, the first time we did this, used this methodology was in the 2011 audit, and you'll notice that the responses by most of the trade were very similar in terms of things that they absolutely require before they'll make a purchase as they were in 2011. There's a couple differences. For example, in the retail industry, some of the things that were important to them in 2011 declined in 2016. What that means then is something's going on relative to willingness to pay. So if this is our platform, these are the basic requirements to do business, then we have to have some things happening beyond that that are significant relative to willingness to pay. And that's what those data look like. The number of companies that were willing to pay more for quality attributes that we build into the production system actually increased between 2011 and 2016. So what that means for all of you is this is an opportunity to do things proactively in the industry to recapture value that is currently being thrown out and scattered to the wind. The downside to this is that if I look at how much they're willing to pay for those traits, so we have more people willing to pay for additional quality attributes, but they're willing to pay less than they were in 2011. And so that's the downside to what we've learned in this study. So going forward, as we try and differentiate products, we're going to be looking to add tangible quality characteristics to those products that differentiate one branded program from another branded program. More people are going to be willing to pay more premiums for that product, but they're not going to be willing to pay as much premium for that product as they have in the past. And so we're starting probably to meet our saturation point relative to product differentiation. The second part of the interview process is to conduct what we call a relative importance evaluation. This is a mathematical method by which we're basically able to quantify responses relative to what's more important and what's less important relative to quality. Now keep in mind that we've allowed each market sector of the industry to define those 7 quality buckets the way that they think that they should be defined. So whenever we look at these rankings, we have to look at them in the context of how each market sector defined each of those buckets. This is the way that looks like for steers and heifers. Basically, you'll see that for a great number of things, particularly food safety, there is a huge ranking, a huge differential in the ranking of basically 2 things here relative to what is important downstream in the production chain. And I know that we've struggled to try and figure out what to do about food safety on the pre-harvest level, but this is something that is increasingly, audit after audit, becoming more important to your customers. And so we've got to continue to, we've done some great things relative to food safety. There's absolutely no question about it. But it is still of significant business importance to your customers downstream. The other thing that's important, if you look at just the packing sector of the industry, what is most important to packers is the composition of the cattle to this day. That's a little bit of a shift from 2011, but I think we all know that packers are still interested in lean, fat, and bone. They're interested in the proportion of edible product that comes out of an animal versus the proportion of less valuable product that is produced from the animal, and that will always be the case relative to their purchasing requirements. When you drop down then and look at the other industry sectors, though, that changes. The second most important thing to the rest of the industry is eating satisfaction. So what I mean by showing you this is let's not lose sight of the fact that eating satisfaction is still driving what's important to our customers downstream. It's what we do that's really, really good, and we need to make sure we continue to take advantage of it and maintain its relative importance compared to other protein sources. When I start looking at what's ranked third across the differing market sectors, then things start to get a little hazier. Each sector of the industry then starts to sort of differentiate themselves on things that are important specifically to their portion of the production chain. We asked the companies, does your company require your suppliers to source cattle raised using any live quality assurance programs? What we're interested in here, of course, is it important to retailers and food service operators and everybody downstream that services consumers that we implement beef quality assurance upstream in the production chain? And we've had lots of conversations about this as we've evaluated these data. But if you think about it, we've done a pretty good job of telling each other about what we need to do that's right and wrong relative to beef quality assurance. But we haven't done a real good job of telling all our customers what we're doing that's right and what's wrong. And so as a consequence, when we asked people at retail and food service and the other levels of the production chain, what do you know about the quality assurance programs that have been implemented upstream? They don't really know a lot about them. You can see that only about 15 of the packers, 14 of the retailers, 8 of the food service operators, and 21 of the 64 processors understood that something was happening upstream that was an integral part of we care relative to producing the product. And so this is something we think we're going to have to do more with in the future. Relative to what's the image of your industry, the image of your industry is still very strong on the part of the production chain. So downstream in production towards the consumer, everybody believes that our image is strong. You all are doing a great job relative to maintaining your values and ethics, and they think that that's important. And if you look across there, you'll see that that's true across all the sectors of the production chain. Relative to strengths, the industry believes that our strength, as I've just mentioned and discussed, is still the quality. And what they meant by quality here was the eating satisfaction component of beef. We need to make sure that we maintain that. That's still important to them. Remember that more and more often, though, we're having to do that with food safety being a requirement of purchase as well. So product quality is the number one response across the board. One of the packers said to us, the product is what's important. Even though it really is high priced, people still love it. And so we're producing a higher priced consumer product. It obviously has to have some satisfaction characteristics associated with it for them to warrant that expenditure. And so it appears to us like we're still doing that, and we're doing a good job of it. The ability to supply a wholesome product, no other beef compares to U.S. beef. We need to use our food safety systems all the way back into livestock production and capture value from that in the production chain. What are the weaknesses of the industry? These slides probably are not going to do real justice to this, and so I want to hone in on this just for a moment. If you look across there, every one of the market sectors of the industry, either in first place ranking or second place ranking, made comments about how good a job we're doing marketing our product. They're not saying that we're not promoting our product here. That's not what they mean. What they mean is we're not telling consumers what we're doing that's right relative to their product. We have a consumer base that has become disengaged and disenfranchised from livestock production, and so we have got to take the reins and be more aggressive in helping consumers understand what we do and how we do it correctly. This goes hand in hand with the findings before that says that we're not doing a good job of marketing our BQA program downstream in the production system. Someone's making a lot of money while someone else is losing a lot of money in the industry. We still have some disconnects relative to communicating financially among the industry sectors. Sorry, I went the wrong way. And then they said that we don't communicate well enough. It's difficult to make changes when we have an island mentality among the various sectors of the production chain. So we have to work together more aggressively to overcome. We're facing a war. I'm going to show you the last slide here. These are the threats that the companies felt like we're facing going forward to the industry. You'll notice that public perception is the number one component there relative to the sectors of the industry that are closest to the consumer. So what this means is we're fighting a war, everybody. We've got to be more aggressive in addressing this disenfranchisement with our consumers. We have to figure out ways. This is going to require some creativeness, some new ways of thinking. We're going to have to do things differently, seriously, if we're going to address this problem. But it is the number one issue facing us moving forward as a threat. We need to figure out how to make consumers part of our production system again. And that's what the comments from each sector of the industry told us. There's a big distrust sometimes for big business, and for whatever reason, consumers have sometimes expressed a distrust in our production system. So if you'll look at the 4-pager that you have in front of you, it basically summarizes a ranking overall of where the quality buckets ended up standing for 2016. We've contrasted that with the audits that were conducted in 1991 and 2005. Of course, the audits have changed dramatically over that period of time, so I'd be careful about reading too much into this, but I do want to point out to you that some of the things that were identified on the top 10 list in 1991, they've went away. So as everybody this morning has already said, we are making progress in improving beef quality, and this is going to have a value component to your business as we move forward in beef production. Second thing I want to point out is, just like in 2011, the two most important quality attributes were food safety, which most of us in meat science don't think about as being quality, and then secondly, eating satisfaction. And they were in that ranking by a long ways. And so we need to make sure that we continue to ensure those two things are delivered to all of our customers downstream and ultimately to the consumers. Last thing I'm supposed to talk about is the producer survey that we conducted. This is an aided online survey that many of you were asked to fill out a survey on. It was just a thing where you logged into the website and filled out, answered some specific questions. They weren't leading questions, but it was you were aided in how you answered the questions. Basically, the pie graph up there represents the numbers of producers that responded to this survey. We had a total of 809 respondents, and we thought that was a pretty good response pattern relative to basically doing that over a short period of time. These are the responses from all of you relative to what you thought was important and how you defined each of those quality buckets that I demonstrated for you earlier. So relative to how and where cattle are being raised, you thought that it was animal well-being, it was traceability, and it was health. That doesn't necessarily conform with what the downstream sectors of the industry thought. The one I want to point out really clearly to you, it says food safety. If you see about midway down the slide, it talks about how all of you define food safety. And you said basically that it's BQA, it's no violative residues, and it's biosecurity. And although I don't disagree that any of those things are hugely important, that's not how the question was answered by all the sectors that were downstream. And in fact, when we did a cardinal ranking, just like we did of all of the interview responses, of your responses to the survey, this is what those data ended up looking like. You ended up ranking number one, the weight and size of cattle as being the most important thing. You basically said that food safety was second, and then you had cattle genetics ranking third, and cattle genetics was ranked over, technically, eating satisfaction. And so that's a bit of a problem. What that demonstrates is that we have a disconnect. whatever economic signals are being sent back upstream to you as producers is not really conforming with what the customers downstream are saying are important to them. And so somehow we got to figure out how to fix this, because the signal is going to be the incentive for what the changes are for the next 5 years. And if the signal's wrong, then we're not going to make the right changes before we get to the next National Beef Quality Audit. And so we need to figure out moving forward how to correct this disconnect between producers and between the rest of the production chain. And when I say producers there, I'm including all of the sectors of production. Basically, this is the way that you told us that you had made changes during the last 5 years since the 2011 audit. Most of you added improved record-keeping systems. A lot of people adopt BQA. Congratulations on that. That's awesome. We're rooting for it. Upgrading facilities. Those are all excellent things, and those are the things we're talking about that will make progress towards the next audit. We just got to make sure that we're addressing the right objectives when we make those changes, so that we're doing the things that are important to the customers downstream. Our conclusions from this first part of the study is that branded beef program use has increased. I didn't show that in the data, but the use of branded beef programs has increased. You'll see numbers on that in a moment. We think that that's in part to better differentiation of more diverse qualities in the product, but we also think that it's become a mechanism to deal with what has become increasingly large carcass weights and inconsistency in sizes. And so they're using brands to differentiate and break up the population to hit targets to address those problems downstream. The sectors don't understand cattle genetics to improve beef quality. All of you think that we're going to use selection, genetic selection, maybe some molecular characteristics moving forward to make improvement genetically in what we provide to consumers. The customers don't know what that is. And so we have to do maybe more to help understand what we're doing upstream again, to help them understand what genetics are downstream. There's the consistency in size and weight issue is a big problem that we continue to face. And again, we think that they're addressing it with branded beef programs. Food safety dominated all of our conclusions. Food safety is the bottom line when it comes to willingness to pay. And so we've got to continue to work on food safety as an important aspect of production. Although companies are listing portions of the BQA as important to their businesses, they're not specifically citing that you all try to do the right thing when they answer questions about that are directly targeted towards quality assurance programs and livestock production. So what that told us, we think, from this audit, is we need to start marketing and telling people more about what we do in livestock production, so that retailers and food service operators and all those people that work in restaurants around the United States understand that all of you actually do care. You've implemented beef quality assurance programs. We're trying to get better all the time, and we just need to tell them that we're doing that. I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Dr. Savell, and Dr. Savell is going to show you results from the Implant survey. Thank you all very, very much.
So I'm not Dr. Savell. My name is Clay Eastwood. Dr. Savell will be after me. I'm going to kick off the implant portion of the audit by talking about transportation, mobility, and the harvest floor assessment. So first and foremost, collecting data of this magnitude would certainly not have been possible without all of our collaborating institutions. So thanks to all of those guys that helped us get this done. So for the transportation, mobility, and harvest floor assessments, we collected data at 17 beef packers across the United States. And if you just kind of glance at this, you'll see that we tried to capture a good representation of the fed steer and heifer industry across the U.S. As far as the different types of data that we collected, for the first time as a part of this portion of the audit, we collected data in regard to transportation and mobility characteristics. So it's a new feature of the audit and some good information that we have from that. We also collected information on animal ID method, hide color, branding, presence of mud and manure on the hide, presence of cattle horns, carcass bruising, and then condemnations and dentition characteristics. As far as how we collected some of this data, on the transportation and mobility data, transportation specifically, we collected data on 10% of trucks arriving at the facility on the day that we were there. And from those 10% of trucks that we sampled, we looked at cattle mobility on 100% of those cattle coming off the trucks as they exited the truck and then moved towards a scale or a holding pen. The rest of these we collected on the harvest floor and collected about 50% of the day's production that we were there. So as I mentioned, the transportation and mobility data is a new feature of the audit, and here's just some of the big findings that we found. Cattle were in transit to the packing facility for just over 2.5 hours on average, but as you can see here, it ranged from being very close to the packing facility to coming from great distances and traveling on those trailers for long periods of time. Along with that, so distance traveled averaged about 135 miles, but again, some of those cattle were coming from very close to the packing facility, and some were coming from very great distances. We saw that about, on average, there were about 36 head on those cattle trailers arriving at the facility. And then we also looked at trailer dimensions. Most of those trailers arriving at these fed cattle plants were potbelly style trailers, so no surprise there. But also interesting here, we looked at the area allotted per animal on those trailers, and we found that on average, those animals were receiving just over 12 square feet on those trailers. And so there's a small box up there, and I know it's probably a little bit difficult for you guys to see, but one of the things that we found is based on recommended animal handling guidelines, for a 1,000-pound hornless animal, they require at least 12 square feet on that trailer. So if we look at the average of just over 12 square feet, we know that cattle are getting larger, and so that with increasing live cattle size, we probably need a little bit more room there on those trailers, or fewer cattle on the trailers to accommodate that size. For mobility, this is the scale that we used as outlined by the North American Meat Institute. So we said that animals arriving with normal mobility would be scored a number 1, and then as mobility declined or got worse, those animals would be categorized as a number 4, and those animals were extremely reluctant to move, even when encouraged or were statue-like. So again, this is a new feature of the audit, and I believe this information tells a really positive story for the beef industry. So we found that almost 97% of cattle arriving at the packing plants where we surveyed had normal mobility. 3% had a mobility score of a number 2, 0.1% mobility score of number 3, and then 0% mobility score number 4. And then as far as downers, that 0 is truly a 0. Of the cattle we surveyed, there were 0 downers that we saw. As far as cattle with identification, we found that 95.6% of cattle surveyed on the harvest floor had some form of identification, whether that be a lot tag, an EID tag, a metal clip, just some form of identification, which is down just a little bit from the 2011 audit. We also noticed that in terms of number of forms of identification, about 60% of animals had at least one form of identification, about 22% had 2 forms, 11.5% 3 forms, and then 1.5% of cattle had 4 forms of ID, and then a very small percentage had 5 forms of identification. Looking at hide color, so we assessed predominant hide color or apparent breed type, and what we found was that about 58% of cattle had a predominant hide color of black, probably to no surprise. 20% of cattle had a Holstein apparent breed type, 11% were red, and then it kind of trails off from there. So compared to the 2011 audit, predominantly black-hided cattle decreased by about 3 percentage points, and Holstein cattle, or apparent breed type, actually increased from about 5.5% in the 2011 audit. And so some of the reasons for this may have just been, market conditions leading up to this and the cattle that we surveyed over 2016. But also we surveyed, like I mentioned, we surveyed 17 plants throughout the year last year and tried to pick up a wider variety of plants throughout the U.S. Looking at the presence of cattle horns, we found that just over 83% of cattle surveyed did not have horns, whereas 16% and 16.7% did not have, or had horns, And so we saw the number of cattle with no horns increase from 2011. And of those cattle that did have horns, about 5.5% were categorized as less than an inch. 8.3% had horns 1 to 5 inches in length, and then just under 3% had horns that were greater than 5 inches in length. Switching to carcass bruising, we found in 2016 that just over 61% of cattle surveyed did not have a bruise, and so this is down quite a bit from the 2011 audit. And then in terms of, sometimes we see carcasses with multiple bruises on a single animal, and so we found that 28% of those carcasses had a bruise or a single bruise. Just over 8% had 2 bruises, just over 2% had 3 bruises, and then it declined pretty drastically there for 4 and greater than 4 bruises. So bruise location, so we categorized where those bruises were located on the carcass. So of those carcasses with a bruise, about 30% were located on the loin area, 27.8% were located on the round, 16.5% were located on the chuck area, just under 15% on the rib, and the remaining just under 12% were located on the brisket, plate, or the flank area of that carcass. And so from there, even though we saw more carcass bruising in the 2016 data, I guess kind of the silver lining or the good portion of this is that 77% of the cattle, we categorized their bruise severity as minimal. And so you see down at the bottom there, we have the scale or the reference that we utilize to categorize these bruises. And so we said that minimal would result in less than a pound of surface trim loss. A major bruise would be 1 to 10 pounds of surface trim loss. A critical bruise greater than 10 pounds, and an extreme bruise would be loss of the entire primal. So again, even though we saw greater carcass bruising in the 2016 audit, 77% of those were categorized as minimal. Just over 20% were categorized as major, 1.7% critical, and then under 1% were those extreme bruises where the entire primal would be lost. Off-all condemnations, so we have here liver, lungs, visceras, heads, and tongues, where we assess 50% of those carcasses and heads and tongues coming through. We see here over time that we've had a greater percentage of liver, lung, and viscera off-all condemnations, and that's increased from the 2005 audit, has increased steadily over time. And you see there especially that those liver condemnations have really taken off since 2011. But the good news is we have fewer head and tongue condemnations over time, and those have really decreased. So looking at specific reasons for the liver and lung condemnations, we see that the biggest reason livers get condemned on the viscera table is a result of liver abscess, whether that be a minor abscess or a major abscess on the liver. And that is the greatest reason for liver condemnations. That is followed by liver contamination at about 10%, and then liver flukes just over 1% for condemnations. Lungs were primarily condemned for contamination, but also pneumonia, and we had varying degrees of pneumonia that we looked at. So some of the big key trends that we observed on the harvest floor assessment, we saw fewer cattle with identification, fewer black-hided cattle, and more Holstein cattle in this audit, more cattle without a brand or horns, fewer carcasses without bruising, or essentially, in other words, more carcass bruising, more liver, lung, and viscera condemnations, and fewer head and tongue condemnations. One other part I didn't mention earlier on, a new kind of key feature to the 2016 audit, is we looked at whether or not slaughter cattle or carcasses were actually dragging the floor or equipment throughout the packing plant. And this kind of came about because we know that packers have had to accommodate larger cattle and larger carcasses coming through their kill floors. And so we just wanted to kind of get a baseline and a benchmark for how those packers were accommodating that larger size. And what we found was that 6.3% of all cattle surveyed were actually dragging or touching some form of equipment throughout the kill floor. So that was another interesting part of this audit. And with that, Dr. Savell, it's actually your turn now.
Thank you, Clay. I'm going to move into the implant carcass assessment. And the part that I'll talk about, I'm going to talk about kind of two areas. One's the implant carcass assessment, and also the camera information, instrument grading information that we had that we looked at. So here's a list of the plants that we went to for the implant carcass assessment. So that's kind of the basically all of them. So it's all around the country, and you can kind of see where we've been and where we went there. In this case, we looked at 10% of the carcasses per day, and our attempt was to have 10% of a lot. So however the lot came in, so if you had 200 head in a lot, you would get 20 of the carcasses there. If you had, 50 head lot, that's 5 and things like that. So, if you think somewhere in there, that 10%, that kind of gets you up into that 90,000 head per day category, which is probably about right on fed cattle. And so that gives you an idea of where we were. In this case, the data were collected from January of 2016 to December of 2016. We worked with USDA and the Agriculture Marketing Service and had grading supervisors that actually called out anything that would need to have an official grade associated with it. So marbling score, maturity, kidney and pelvic heart fat, those kinds of things like that. Anything else we could measure, we would measure from that standpoint. So everything we have is an official USDA grade from that standpoint. And so I want to give a big thank you to USDA for providing the folks, and they were great to work with, and we've done that for a number of years. But it really is helpful to have them in the plant and being able to collect this information. This is just kind of a couple of things that we observed. So the research teams being in the plant, being the cooler, would be going along here collecting data. So on the data sheets, there were a lot of places that we could write down information. One of the things we did in there is also to include things like G programs. And so if they had a various schedule that they're working with USDA as far as a program like a certified Angus beef type example, so you would have that, and we would capture that information. So there were 20% of the cattle, so 1 out of 5 carcasses coming down the line would have been in part of a G schedule program. In house grade, we had 7.5%. Those that were qualified or some kind of natural program, 1.4%. And we ran into a very, very small number of grass-fed that were in here, about 0.2%. Now, when you break that G program out, and we've not had a chance to kind of talk to any of the program people. I know we've got several people here from Certified Angus. We haven't gone back and compared our numbers to some of their statistics, and that'd be interesting to kind of hear from them and get their reaction. These were the top programs we found that were the G programs, and so 7.9% then were certified Angus beef. National Beef had 2 programs that were involved in this. The Black Angus, Canyon Angus beef, that was 2.6%. Then you see all the way over to the right, then 1.7 in their Premium Reserve program. Then Swift Premium Black Angus was 2.1%. All the other G programs, G schedules that we saw added up to about 5.9%. So again, most time when we go into a plant, almost everybody had kind of 2 programs there. So they would have like a CAB program, and then they'd have their own program. And a lot of times their own program might be something else that might not fit from a weight standpoint, some other characteristic that they might have. And so that was kind of one of the things that we noticed on this. Our estimated breed type that we did, so research teams would look at the carcasses and try to determine if they thought they were native, if they thought they were Bos indicus. So Bos indicus would have a hump that would at least be about 4 inches in height, and then or if it had dairy conformation, and that's kind of how we did that. So you just a visual assessment of what the carcasses look like to kind of put them in these categories. And this matches up with what Clay told you earlier. We don't have the same plant, so it's not a true apples to apples comparison for where we went from all of the plants that we evaluated. But when you look at this, you can see there that in the 2016, we had 15.9% of them that would have been in the dairy type. And so we drew a line, you kind of notice on this, and you go back to the 2000 audit with about nearly 7% of the carcasses that would have been classified as dairy type, then up to almost 16%. And so we just kind of drew that line that number has increased. If you look at that also, the Bos indicus type, those that would have a parent Bos indicus kind of breed, has kind of precipitously dropped off too over time. And so I think that's probably reflective of some of the breeding programs or some of the things where crossbreeding where you probably have de-emphasized some of the high percentage cattle over time. So it's kind of interesting to kind of look at that, just kind of see how those kind of shake out. It probably shouldn't, you didn't come here to learn that carcasses are heavier today. You already knew that. But I think it's interesting to take a look at this chart here to kind of look at this. I commented yesterday when we were looking back at the slide, and I said, we've got this little dragon tail over here to the left of these carcasses. There's just not very many in them. But when you look at those numbers, those are the 6-weight carcasses. And it's amazing that we're out here at this point, in 2017 at this, and looking at the minority and the very few 6-weight carcasses. And in my lifetime, those were kind of the standards when we got kind of started at this. And so, if you took those off, we could truly get back to our bell-shaped curve. The average carcass weight is 860 pounds. And again, early in my career, that was kind of a monster. And so again, that's our average at that point. But it also tells you that we've got carcasses, we've got, the bell-shaped curve on either side of that. So that also tells you if we're averaging 860, that usually we're going to end up having 200-pound range on either side of that that's going to kind of capture kind of 95% of the carcasses. So it's not uncommon to find some very large ones there. I don't remember right now, Clay could probably remind me on that. I know that we did find some 1,100 and 1,200-pound carcasses in the plants, and so every once in a while, those of you that are familiar, or those of you that go collect data and see that, it's not uncommon to see some very, very large carcasses that do show up in that. And then again, this is just a chart just kind of showing the increasing in hot carcass weight over time. And just as we've gone from 1991 up into 2016. I won't predict the future. I don't know what will happen in 5 years from now, but if I had to predict it based on that, they'll just keep getting larger and larger on that. Now, this is a chart that we've had in previous rollouts of the quality audit, just kind of taking a look at, well, you know, if you had prime and choice and select carcasses, kind of what are their characteristics? And so this just shows you kind of like the fat thickness for prime is about 63/100ths and choice 59/100ths and select 47/100ths of an inch. Ribeye area goes the opposite direction. So the ribeyes and select carcasses are larger than what they are for choice or for the prime. Carcass weights are actually higher for the prime, probably goes without saying when we think about those having more finish on them. And then the yield grade obviously is a little bit higher for the prime compared to choice and compared to select. So the nice thing about the data set we have, you can kind of look at it in any way you want to. And I was thinking about it today, Clay was looking back at something. You know, when we started this in 1991, you know, we were still using mainframe computers to analyze all this stuff. And, you know, if you want to ask her something, she can go over here on her laptop and get you an answer pretty quick on that. So there's been a lot of changes not only in the cattle, but in our ability to be able to mine data on a moment's notice. The number of carcasses that graded kind of at least prime, choice, or select, or those that fit, you know, today's market, that number is good, 94.3%. So very few outliers from that, and I think that's great news for the beef industry. And if you look at the number of choice and prime over time, if you notice in this that we've seen this uptake, and of course I know this past year, even past spring, we were doing a project where we needed to get some select beef, and we were working with end user product. He said, you know, the problem right now, because there's so little select beef being produced, we're buying product that is in a box that says select or higher, and we're pulling out choice product out of it. Now, I know that that kind of comes and goes and such, but, you know, we've seen some very high percentages of choice grading back during this year, and we obviously saw it back during this past year. And so I think that's good news that we're seeing more that fit the market from a higher end and fewer that don't fit, and so that's great news for the industry. We've also seen this over in the prime grade, and so again, during this past year, we had 3.8% of the carcasses that fit in prime. I will tell you, the Holstein cattle help that number, and so that's not a surprise to anyone on that. So that would be one of the benefits that you would have from that. The fat thickness, they were probably a little bit fatter than what we've seen, but again, that's the reflection of probably the size and probably from a relative standpoint from that deal. And again, market conditions and things like that can have an impact on that. And then the yield grade, the other thing we talked about is that, we're probably going to be always around a yield grade 3. It's going to be a 2.9, 3, 3.1, something like that, because again, as the carcasses get heavier, that becomes something that detracts from yield grade, but if they get more muscular, then that kind of help offsets that. And so somewhere in here, that's about where we're going to be, and that's probably what we'll continue to be on that. Probably the number that has the greatest impact, at least on a lot of the marketing grids, because the discounts and things are going to be numbers of yield grade 4s and 5s. And so this past year we had 14.5% of them that were in that, and that number kind of goes up and down. One of the people we worked with, I thought was interesting, he said, it was like there wasn't as much of a discount in 4s and 5s, said, this past year or the year before that, you're just trying to get cattle. So you weren't worried so much about what the discounts be, you had to have cattle. And so then as you have more cattle available, then the grids will reflect that and will start having an impact as far as what will happen on that. Now these are the last couple slides I have or this last slide on the implant part. And this is just showing you the numbers from 2011 to 2016. So you can see the yield grade were 2.9 up to 3.1, fat thickness up a little bit. Carcass weight makes the biggest jump in that. Ribeye area, just this slight increase. But you also see the reflection where the quality grade is at, the marbling score is at small 70 versus small 40. So that's a pretty good size increase, and that probably reflects, again, that 72% of the cattle that are going to grade prime or choice within that. Let me move to the instrument grading assessment. In 2011, it was the first year that we had access to it. We really thank the companies that provided information. They don't have to do this, but they did. And so we worked with, one of the nice things about it, I think everybody we worked with were former students of Keith or ours. So that kind of makes that a nice opportunity to be able to do that. But they shared with a week's worth of information per month from their plants, and then we put this all together so it's all merged, and so that we're not sharing anybody's information within that. But when you look at the power of this, we have 4.5 million carcasses to be able to analyze in that. And so that's that's the largest database probably that is accessible and can be published now and be available for everybody. So we really appreciate all the people that have worked with us to get that information. And again, all that's like in an Excel spreadsheet. That wouldn't have happened years ago. And so the fact that you can do that and be able to analyze that looks good. Here's kind of the grading, carcasses grading choice by month. And again, they're ranging anywhere from kind of the 69 to 71, 72%. You could probably overlay, if you're wanting to look at more information, you could probably look at some choice select spreads over that time and some other kind of conditions and just kind of look at that. But I thought that was kind of interesting to look at least some seasonal. In the 2011 audit, we didn't have monthly. We had like every other month. So this is the first time we really had monthly data we could share. So that's really nice from that standpoint. This also shows the differences between what we had from the instrument assessment versus the implant assessment we did for the commodity choice and the top choice. And the top choice would be those programs like Certified Angus Beef, usually modest marbling or above, and the prime. And so you can see that in the comparison on that. These are the comparisons that we had between the 2011 data versus the 2016. So you can see again the yield grade 2.9 versus the 3.1. The 3.1 matches exactly with the implant data. Fat thickness 0.47 to 0.54. Carcass weight again up from that, and then the ribeye area. And then you can see again increase in the marbling score. I love this slide. You know, as an educator, you're always wanting good information you can use to support whatever you've been teaching with. And for years, and those of you who are former students in here, if you can remember any of that, we always talk about dark cutting. We always said, well, dark cutting, at least in Texas, tends to be primarily in October is where we get the largest increase, because that's when we start getting the weather changes. And it's weather changes that probably drive more of this than whether it's consistently hot or consistently cold. And so we, for the first time, have good year-long data that shows that October is the correct date on that. This will now be in my teaching materials on that. The other one that I probably have received over time has been the fact that we'll get calls from the Panhandle, and it'll be August, and say, hey, we're getting a lot of dark cutters in August. And if you notice, other than that September, October, the next kind of that higher deal is during our hot time. So, you know, we don't always have to have cold stress that can cause dark cutters. We can have some heat stress that'll do the same thing there, and so we have that there. But this is just a great set of data to be able to do. The other thing I want to tell you about this, these numbers are relatively low, though. So that's good news. We've got fewer dark cutters. Now, for them to be a dark cutter, probably on the camera, they got to be a pretty severe dark cutter. But even on the implant, when we call dark cutters, we didn't have near as many, or their severity wasn't quite as high. And I think that's probably a reflection, too. You can't control the weather. We know that. But we can control handling. We can control, and the amount of the better handling. Cattle are being handled better today than maybe at any point in the history of cattle handling. And I think about the way that they're being transported, offloaded, handling at the plant. You think about all the educational efforts that have been going on to make sure that cattle are handled the best way they can be. And so I think we're seeing some good reflection of some of that show up in the data, and I think everybody's to be congratulated for the work that they're doing. When you're looking at, again, some other kinds of implant versus instrument assessment, you see here that, again, the differences between the two for prime and for choice and for select, and then the others are going to be the hard bone, they're going to be the standard type, over 30 months of age, any of those that kind of fit into there. Look at yield grade, and virtually they're the same for yield grade 1s and 5s. Slight differences, but again, they're very, very close and line up very well. And then I think the bottom line here, when you look at this, and I think a celebration of the accuracy of both systems, the ability of the instrument to be able to predict the implant, and the ability of the implant to predict the instrument. Look at this information here. So you got 9,000 carcasses with the yield grade 3-1. You have 4.5 million carcasses, yield grade 3-1. You look at fat thickness, 0.02 of a unit difference. You look at carcass weight, about 7 pounds. You look at ribeye, 1/10. But look at this number right here. Look at the marbling score. You have small 70 and you have small 75. Now, anybody that's ever called marbling, if we had everybody in here that's ever done that on a judging team or, you know, whatever it is, and we brought in some carcasses and lined them up here and had everybody call it, we couldn't be within a degree of marbling, much less, you know, 5/100ths of a unit like that. And I think this is great news for the beef industry and the ability to have these systems check independently, third party. So if you're selling beef in whatever system you're selling, and if you're selling on a grid, the confidence that you know that these numbers are correct, that these numbers are accurate to each other, I think that's great information. So what's the bottom line when we take a look at all this? Well, there's numerical increases in yield grades. Probably knew that. But on the good side, we're getting higher grading carcasses. Fat thickness up a little bit. Obviously, hot carcass weight continues to go up. Slight increases in ribeye area. Marbling scores up. We did see that increase in dairy type carcasses in these plants. And then, of course, in prime, and then with yield grade 4s and 5s. We have some great things going on and some things we need to work on, but I think that's always the highlight of the audit, is finding what people are doing well, and then what are some of the things that need to work on from that standpoint. So I'm at the end of this. Deb, you want to come up? Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Dr. Savell. You have all heard a lot of information about the face-to-face interviews, the implant audits, the instrument grading information, and that's just kind of the tip of what we covered during the strategy workshop. So the purpose of the strategy workshop was to bring together about 70 individuals representing producers, packers, our end users. Several of you in this room were there for part or all of that, as well as members of our BQA advisory board, to look at all the information that was collected in phase 1 and phase 2 and to figure out what's that blueprint or that take-home message that we can share with producers and in the community to figure out where we need to focus for the next 5 years before the next audit. And so that's what we did in December. So we took all the information that we had and looked at what is that take-home message. And you see these in your 4-pager, and you can see these outlined a little more detail if you pick up the full executive summary. But we outlined 3 main categories for focused improvement, or big overall strategies, if you will. And the first of those is food safety and animal health, and I'm going to go into these in a little more detail in a minute. Eating quality and reduction of variation or variability in the carcasses, and then optimizing value and eliminating waste. And so if we take each of those individually, you heard a lot of information from Dr. Belk relative to the importance of food safety from our end users, or those that are closest to our consumers. And so that has to be one of our leading areas where we need to focus in the next 5 years. And if we look at some of the tactics that we can look at, or some focus areas on that, one of those would be an information sharing system. And so what are we doing? How can we get information from one segment of the industry to the others? Maybe it's relative to animal identification. Maybe it's improving global market access. If we have that information, lots of things can go into that. The second tactic, if you will, would be looking at preventative health strategies. And so it's not necessarily something specific that producers mentioned in their input, but they did mention BQA, and part of BQA is that use of antimicrobials appropriately and supporting animal health. And so those tie together. And then lastly, a continued effort to improve supply chain safety intervention. And so you should see the link to beef quality assurance, and several of you are involved in that and implementing that on farm and on your ranches and in your feedlots. And so it's just communicating that message a little bit more throughout the system. The second one of those strategies is eating quality and reduction of variability or variety. And so we saw a lot of end users in our strategy workshop talk about how I might order 15-pound and up ribeyes or whatever their spec might be, and they say, but I could have a box that has a 15-pound ribeye, and I could have a box that has a 22-pound ribeye, and that's really hard to cut those for my menu that has 12 ounces on a menu. And so talking about what does a consumer want on their plate, what do we want in a package in the grocery store, and how can we make that uniformity a little bit better from an end user standpoint to make that product kind of desirable or more desirable for the consumer, for their customer. And so developing information systems, again, ties back to the last one, but a key message of communicating between market sectors. Looking at advancement in genetic technologies. Now, if you go back to phase 1, genetics to our end users was color. And so we have a little bit of a disconnect there, but using some genetic technologies to help us improve the reduction of variability in those carcasses and those cattle when they're sent to the plant. And maybe it's improving sorting strategies and having some premium associated with that so that we have the reduction of variability that we need. And then the last strategy that we need to look at is optimizing value and eliminating waste. And the first thing, again, that you see is an information sharing system. So how can we get information throughout the system to clearly give us market signals? You saw that we have 6% of carcasses dragging the floor or dragging equipment. We have carcass weights that have increased. I think it's just over 12% that are over 1,000 pounds. And we have more variability in boxes of product going to our end users, but yet we've seen the discount for weight move up that chain, right? And so I'd have to go back to the data from previous audits of 91 and 95 and 2000 and look at where were the hot carcass weight discounts for producers then compared to where they're at now. But those have definitely changed over time. And again, we can use genetic technologies for this to also manage our carcass variability. We realize that there's barriers to getting this done, and that's one thing that we spent a lot of time on during the strategy workshop of what are the challenges to move forward in these areas. And one of those is communication, not only communication between sectors of the industry, but between segments from production to our end users and getting that message clearly dictated back and forth. But if you run through the end of that list, I'm not going to read all those for you directly. They're in your 4-pager and they're in the executive summary. But that last one is not enough incentive to make BQA a priority. And that goes back to communication and phase 1 information where you had our end users telling us that they have some programs in place or some quality assurance programs in place, but they can't name BQA. And they can't name, they identify different components of beef quality assurance, but they don't really know that they're part of the beef quality assurance program. And so that is one barrier and one way that we can improve. The last part of the strategy workshop is coming up with that lost opportunity. And the lost opportunities that Dr. Belk mentioned earlier are kind of what got us going in the National Beef Quality Audit in the first place. And so we've tried to calculate these every year. And sometimes they're a little difficult to calculate, but we start with identifying what is the target consensus? What should we be producing for our end user population? So we engage them quite a bit during the strategy workshop to figure out what should we be producing from an industry perspective. And this is what they came up with. Quality grade, 5% prime. We're not quite there, but we're getting close. 35% upper 2/3 choice, 35% low choice, and 25% select. Yield grade. Our goal should be 10% yield grade 1s, 45% yield grade 2s, 40% yield grade 3s, and 5% yield grade 4s. That has changed over time. Over time, you probably saw 0% yield grade 4s, but packers are a little more vocal now and they tell us we'll accept a few more yield grade 4s to get a few more cattle that will grade, upper 2/3 choice and prime. And then weight. Our goal should be 20% of carcasses between 600 and 800 pounds, 30% between 800 and 900 pounds, and 50% between 900 and 1,000 pounds. They realize that this doesn't include anything over 1,000 pounds, and that's where 12% of our carcasses fall during the phase 2 or the implant data collection. So using that information, we calculate what we call lost opportunities, and I'd be remiss without recognizing Dustin Pendle at Kansas State. He has helped us calculate these and adjust. If you want to compare over years, you need to go back and adjust over time. So helping us adjust as we change the logic or the way that we calculate these, or as we see things that aren't being able to be reported or prices not reported for 1 year, taking that out of a previous calculation so you have a true comparison. But you can see from 2011 to 2016, we made quite an improvement in quality grade. And that's because we jumped 10% in upper 2/3 choice and prime. Or choice and prime, excuse me. And so that helps that calculation. We lost some ground on yield grade relative to lost opportunity, and that's because of our increase in yield grade 4s and 5s. We lost some ground on carcass weight, but you saw how that carcass weight has increased over time. We made up some ground on hide damage and branding or hide damage and defects that would result in a lost opportunity. And we lost a lot of ground on offal condemnations, and the primary driver behind that is 30% liver condemnations that we saw during phase 2. And so overall, if you look back and compare to the 91 audit, we've made a lot of improvement. And a lot of those improvements that we've seen from 91 to 2016 have to deal with the fact that we implemented a lot of things and put a lot of things in place with beef quality assurance programs. And so from a producer standpoint, you can be proud of the improvements we've made. There's obviously a few places we can work to improve, but hopefully you realize that we've done some things that have helped this over time. And so 25 years of success is what we've witnessed, and there's still room to go, and so we can continue working on that and implementing additional things through BQA or other programs like transportation quality assurance and those sorts of programs that you see coming from producer education. So with that, I think we're ready for questions, but I'll turn it back over to Josh.